Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, my name is Diane Henderson, and I'm pleased to be representing ACT as the co-sponsor for this E.F. Lindquist Award here, and I'm my profound honor to be able to introduce the recipient of the 2023 Lindquist Award, Dr. James Pellegrino. Dr. Pellegrino is currently Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Learning Sciences at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Prior to his retirement from UIC last year, he held the prestigious position of Liberal Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Cognitive Psychology and Distinguished Professor of Education, where he also served as founding co-director of UIC's Learning Science Research Institute. He is a fellow of both AERA and the International Society of the Learning Sciences, a lifetime national associate of the National Academy of Sciences, and a past member of the Board on Testing and Assessment of the National Research Council. He is also an elected lifetime member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Pellegrino's career is marked by a commitment to integrating cognitive science with educational practice, a pursuit that has significantly shaped contemporary approaches to educational assessment and learning environments. A special concern of his research is the incorporation of effective formative assessment practices assisted by technology to maximize student learning and understanding. Increasingly, his research and writing has focused on the role of cognitive theory and technology in educational reform and translating results from the educational and psychological research arenas into the implications for practitioners and policymakers. His career is a testament to his dedication to enhancing the science of learning and assessment. His extensive body of work, which includes leadership roles in numerous state, national, and international committees, reflects a deep commitment to improving educational outcomes through research and policy. Dr. Pellegrino has authored or co-authored over 300 books, chapters, journal articles, and reports. Through these publications and reports, Dr. Pellegrino's insights have shaped assessment design and implementation, providing scientifically grounded recommendations that propel the field forward. In his nomination letter, Dr. Pellegrino's contributions were summarized as follows. His work has connected cognitive and learning theory, assessment, and instruction in ways that are principled, sensible, and practically actionable. The seamless integration of theory and practice lies at the heart of his endeavors, enabling educators and policymakers to make informed decisions that positively impact teaching and learning outcomes. This sentiment echoes the foundational beliefs of E.F. Lindquist, who himself was a trailblazer in the development of educational assessments that served the greater good and were practically actionable. Today, in Dr. Pellegrino's address, Fulfilling a Mission, a Vision of Assessment in Support of Educational and Societal Good, Progress Made, and Miles Still to Go, he will be reflecting on the visionary ideas of E.F. Lindquist and Robert Glaser, who foresaw the transformative power of assessments that are deeply connected to curriculum, instruction, and student learning. These assessments, they believed, would leverage advances in technology and insights from research on human learning to enhance educational and societal outcomes. Dr. Pellegrino will be evaluating the progress made towards realizing this vision and the challenges that lie ahead and the critical need for next-generation assessments that support equitable and ambitious teaching and learning. As noted in his nomination letter, Dr. Pellegrino has been a beacon of innovation and integrity in the fields of educational assessment. His work not only bridges the gap between theory and practice, but illuminates the path forward for future generations. I am sure this address will help illuminate the path forward for all of us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Pellegrino.
Thank you, Diane, for that gracious introduction. And thank you all for being here. The last part of my title, Yet Miles to Go, was not intended to talk about what it took to get to this arena. On the other hand, I know it was a hike. So what am I going to talk about today in this Lindquist Award address? I want to start by by giving credit and paying homage to the predecessors' visions for educational assessment. As Diane said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about E.F. Lindquist and Robert Glaser. And then I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about benchmarking progress. What progress have we made with respect to that vision from the turn of the 21st century to the present? And then, after evaluating that, turn to important challenges that we need to embrace. And then finally, I'll conclude with some ideas about what it's going to take to attain that vision. So let's start with some of the important visions for educational assessment. First, with E.F. Lindquist, I think many people know that Lindquist was an assessment developer par excellence. He's credited with a number of assessments that he developed, including the ACT. And what's interesting is I think a lot of people don't realize how, when he conceptualized the ACT, he conceptualized it as very different from the SAT, even though in current practice, people think of them as almost synonymous. What he really deeply cared about in all of his assessment development work was the importance of what is assessed and its potential impact. And this quote is reflective of that. Our philosophy is that since the tests are in any event bound to influence teaching, we might as well ensure that their influence is in the right direction. So at a time when we oftentimes talk about teaching to the test as being a bad thing, he actually had the conception that the test should represent important outcomes and that they should reflect what it is we want to be going on in the classroom in terms of ambitious goals for instruction. He was also an inventor, and he invented the optical scanner. He had a background, actually, in mathematics and physics, and he had a conception about what technology could do. And so in '68, he wrote, "In the future, we will use our amazing machine not only to do more and more testing more and more efficiently, but to do better and better testing as well." Now, we know that one of the consequences of that machine was large-scale standardized testing was implemented, but I think he had a conception of what technology could do, even though, if we think about it in terms of the time in which he was writing, the level of technology development was still very immature in terms of what we had as it might relate to education. He also foresaw a future in which the testing materials will be almost indistinguishable from the learning materials. Now, this is just a little interesting personal note. The first course in statistics I ever had as an undergraduate used this book by Blomers and Lindquist. It's actually a volume that still sits on my bookshelf because I treasured this volume so much. But I don't blame Lindquist for any failures I've had in the area of understanding statistics. That's my own fault. So I want to turn to another person, Robert Glaser, and sort of some may wonder, well, okay, this is the Lindquist Award lecture. Why am I talking about Robert Glaser? Well, there's several reasons why I'm interjecting him into the conversation, not the least of which is the fact that he actually was a Lindquist Award winner in 1998. But as I said at last year's award ceremony when I received the award, were it not for Robert Glaser, I would not be the recipient of this award. I would not have pursued in my career the areas of inquiry that Bob helped me see as a path for my future research direction. I was very fortunate with my first academic position as an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh and as a research associate in the Learning Research and Development Center to work with Bob Glaser and to be influenced by him. In particular, his vision about what learning theory could and should do with respect to helping us understand assessment and the development of high-quality assessments. And I've In 1991, I pulled a quote out from something he wrote, and I'll read it, but basically it characterizes how he was thinking about what we were learning by that point in time from educational psychology, cognitive psychology, the beginning of the learning sciences, in terms of the nature of human learning and its potential use in the design of assessments. Essential characteristics of proficient performance have been described in various domains and provide useful indices for assessment. We know that at specific stages of learning, there exist different integrations of knowledge, different forms of skill, differences in access to knowledge, and differences in the efficiency of performance. These stages can define criteria for test design. We can now propose a set of candidate dimensions along which subject matter competence can be assessed. As competence in a subject matter grows, evidence of a knowledge base that is increasingly coherent, principled, useful, and goal-oriented is displayed, and test items can be designed to capture such evidence. Bob truly had a belief that the knowledge that was emerging from research on learning could be channeled into the design of assessments that would actually be more useful to support ongoing and teaching and learning. And of course, he wrote this in 1991, and in many ways, what he's writing here is a reflection of the same issues we're continuing to deal with today. So a couple of key takeaways about the combined vision. I think they were prescient about the future of assessment and its capabilities for educational and societal good. They really, both of them envisioned assessments measuring valued educational goals and outcomes based upon curriculum and the processes of classroom instruction and learning. And they saw advances in two areas as having major future impacts on the design, use, and interpretation of assessments. One was the capability of technology, even as limited as it might have been or existed in the 1970s and 1990s relative to what we can do now. And also the notion that knowledge about the nature of knowing and learning emerging from research in the cognitive and learning sciences had a lot to say potentially with respect to thinking about the design, use, and interpretation of assessments. So my question when I put this together is thinking to myself, well, how much of their vision has been realized? What's left to do? And what's it going to take to make further progress? And in the remainder of my remarks, I will try to answer those questions. So one way to think about this, and I wanted to think about it, is benchmarking progress. Let's talk about where we were at the turn of the 21st century and where we are now. And what progress have we made? For me, this has been I'm going to do this as a sort of personal journey to some extent in terms of my attempts to connect cognition, instruction, and assessment. And I'll do it in terms of projects that I've had some degree of involvement in that I think have contributed along this path. So where do we start? Well, I would say we start at the turn of this century with the landmark reports, How People Learn and Knowing What Students Know. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Followed by work that appeared later in this, actually in the decade of 2010 to 2020, where we had new frameworks for science education, as well as discussions about the kinds of knowledge and skills that people needed to succeed in the 21st century, the report Education for Life and Work. That has been followed by attempts to use the knowledge base that was emerging and the thinking about what we wanted students to know and be able to do, to think about how do we develop assessments for these new science standards, and then how do we develop classroom assessments in areas of STEM, again, drawing upon what has been developed in the knowledge base. I've also had the privilege of thinking about some of the issues associated with ways in which technology and our capabilities can help in the validation of score meaning for the next generation of assessments, as well as what that next generation of assessments might need to look like in terms of the kinds of knowledge and skills we want students to be able to develop and be able to assess. And lastly, I'm going to come back to a report which actually was just issued this past Wednesday from the National Academy of Education on reimagining balanced assessment systems. So I'm going to use these and other things along the way to tell the story. It's a story in words and pictures, where the pictures are what I consider to be landmark or significant reports that actually provide concrete demonstration of the progress we've made in certain areas. So let's start with how people learn and knowing what students know. I think, as many of you know, How People Learn, Brain, Mind, Experience in School actually was first published in 1999. And there was a companion volume to it called How People Learn, Bridging Research and Practice that John Bransford and I and Suzanne Donovan put together. Those two things were put together in the expanded edition, that's the 2000 edition of How People Learn. It is probably one of the most downloaded reports ever issued by the National Academy of Sciences. The last time I checked, How People Learn had something like 38,000 citations. Now, the companion to that, in some respects, was Knowing What Students Know. It was a committee that I co-chaired with Bob Glazer, incidentally. So it was a chance for us to collaborate again, and with Naomi Trudowski. And I'm going to focus more on the main messages from Knowing What Students Know, because they frame the argument I want to make about the progress we've made. So Knowing What Students Know had a number of critical messages. One was that assessment is fundamentally a process of reasoning from evidence. That is, we can never truly know what a student knows. We do not have the capacity to do what we can do in physical measurement. We are trying to essentially, quote, measure or make estimations about the nature of knowledge, skills, and abilities, which is not, obviously and transparent. So the argument was that this process of reasoning from evidence is founded on three interconnected elements that was called the assessment triangle, which I'll come back to in a minute. It also argued that assessment should be based on the latest in contemporary theory and research about the nature of knowing and learning and their development within disciplinary domains. In essence, it basically said, everything that has been summarized and characterized in How People Learn is the knowledge base from which we should be working in terms of thinking about the cognition part of this whole assessment development enterprise. We also noted in that report that technology offered numerous affordances to improve assessment, including expanding the range of stimuli and the kinds of tasks and situations that we could use that would represent important constructs that were not otherwise accessible through conventional paper and pencil testing. And the last thing I would sort of say of significance that we argued is that assessments across all levels of the educational enterprise, from the classroom to the district to the state, should be conceptually coherent and help contribute to balanced assessment systems. So I'm going to touch on all of these over the course of the talk. For those of you who don't know the assessment triangle, and I wonder if there's any of my friends in this room who do not know that, some have said at some point it will be engraved on my tombstone. But the assessment triangle is a way to capture in a succinct form the idea of assessment as a process of reasoning from evidence. The process begins and must begin with this so-called cognition vertex, what it is that we know from theory, research, et cetera, about what it means to know something. What are the things we want students to know? What do we know about the nature of how that is manifest? And what are the most important parts of that knowledge base, whether it's in mathematics or science or history or in literacy. Our conception of what it means to know and learn then drives the design of the observations, because the observations are the only thing where students can show us what it is that they know by essentially responding to tasks and situations where we ask them to do something. So those observations need to be connected to our conception of what kind of knowledge we're interested in and what it will take for the students to show us that. And then, of course, the last part is we have to be able to interpret that evidence. We have to have ways to make meaning from it, to connect it back to the important ideas that we're interested in with respect to the cognition piece of this. So it basically argued these three elements need to be coordinated, interconnected, but essentially assessment has to start with what we know from theory and research about what are the important things that students know, how they learn, and then what would be the evidence of that would allow us to actually make inferences about student achievement. So what progress have we made over the last 20 years? I'm going to sort of try to talk about that in terms of what's changed. So as important as knowing what students know and how people learn were at the turn of this century, in the intervening 20 plus years, a lot has changed. So one of the things that has changed, and it's captured in volumes like How People Learn Too, Learners, Contexts, and Cultures, is that our theories and models and data on disciplinary knowing and learning have changed substantially and are best represented by a broad sociocultural perspective on the general nature of knowing and learning, combined with theory and research on discipline-specific learning progressions. It's not arguing that what was summarized in How People Learn 1 is somehow wrong. It's actually saying that's a foundation and it builds from it in terms of what we now know about learning as a social cognitive process, a sociocultural process. The other thing that has changed substantially, and this in some ways it's a reflection of what we've learned about learning and knowing, is that the standards and expectations for disciplinary proficiency have also changed accordingly. They now demand integrated knowledge of core disciplinary knowledge and reasoning practices. And the framework for K-12 science education is a great illustration of that, but you can also find it in the standards for mathematics and the standards for literacy. What we want what we expect in terms of proficiency is not just a body of factual or procedural knowledge, but knowledge in which students can essentially reason with that core knowledge. And so we have different kinds of standards and expectations, and those standards have had major implications for the design and implementation of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. They pose significant challenges for practice in all three areas. What else has changed? We understand from studies of classrooms that coherence among curriculum, instruction, and assessment is essential to achieve ambitious and equitable classroom learning environments. It requires that all three components are derived from conceptual models and empirical data on human development, disciplinary knowing and learning, and effective instruction. Articles and various papers by Laurie Shepard and others about ambitious teaching and equitable assessment emphasize how much our knowledge base has grown about what makes for powerful teaching and learning and the construction of learning environments in the classroom. What else has changed? Well, the affordances of technology to support assessment design and interpretation have greatly increased, including interactive and adaptive stimulus materials, response data capture, applications of AI, data analytic, and computational tools. There's a very nice volume coming out soon, I believe, on uses of artificial intelligence in STEM education. Joe Kraychek over there was one of the co-editors of this. And it is a great summary of essentially how we can think about what technology and AI and various other tools can do in terms of assessment and teaching and learning in STEM. So I have a summary claim that I'm going to try to back up with evidence. And my summary claim is that if we look at where we are now, we've made considerable progress since 2000, 2001. And it's consistent with the core ideas, principles, and claims of how people learn and knowing what students know. It builds on that in many important ways, and it has to do with the claims as related to what's the role of technology, what do we know about teaching, what do we know about learning, what do we know about assessment, and what do we know about their integration. So let me try to provide some of the evidence. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the three elements of the assessment triangle. I'm going to start with the cognition piece. Earlier I said that our empirical knowledge of disciplinary learning has increased exponentially, covering multiple areas of STEM education. And we can see this in terms of reports and other things on learning trajectories in mathematics. This is one example of a report, as well as the literature on learning progressions in science. And I've listed here three reports, one of which is not even out yet and is forthcoming, which is a handbook of research on science learning progressions. The point is that over time, since 2000, we have had systematic bodies of knowledge developed about how learning progresses in the various disciplines and how that is connected to disciplinary learning standards. So the cognition piece has expanded tremendously over that time. And then what about evidence related to the observation piece? Well, if that's the knowledge base now from which we can begin to think about designing assessment, what has happened with respect to the observation piece? Well, I think one of the most important things that has happened over the last 20 years is we have a principled assessment design frameworks embodying the assessment as a process of reasoning from evidence perspective. Many of you know about these two perspectives. One is the evidence-centered design approach from Bob Mislevy and his colleagues, and the other is the construct mapping approach from Mark Wilson and his colleagues. Well, the important thing is not only do we have these frameworks, but they have been applied to contemporary STEM disciplinary learning knowledge as well as disciplinary content frameworks. And this has been done for both large-scale and classroom assessment applications. I mentioned the report that's on the far left, classroom-based STEM assessment. If you look in that volume, you'll see many chapters that talk about applications of principled assessment design in areas of STEM, as well as all the things we still need to know. You can see that in the report on developing assessments for the next generation science standards. Also in the work that Joe Kraychek, Christopher Harris, Dan Damelin, and I did in trying to use these design frameworks to create assessments that are aligned with the standards that can be used in the classroom. So earlier this year, a volume came out, Creating and Using Instructionally Supportive Assessments in NGSS Classrooms. And if you go to the Next Generation Science Assessment website, you will find sets of tasks that have been developed explicitly to support classroom instruction related to the next generation science standards. And as I've attended sessions at this meeting, I've heard numerous cases where people are using evidence-centered design in other areas of STEM. The session I was at the other day where Stephen McGee was there was talking about using this for computational thinking. So the thing is that we now have ways to harness the knowledge base about learning and progressions of learning into designs for assessment. And what about the interpretation piece? Well, we have sophisticated measure and data analytic models, including Bayesian models, cognitive diagnostic models, machine learning methods, and AI tools. We are not just limited to unidimensional IRT, although much of what happens in assessment is still unidimensional IRT. And we've also greatly expanded the forms of relevant data that we can collect, analyze, and evaluate, including response process data, verbal data, graphical information, eye movements, gestures. In other words, we can essentially harness evidence of various sorts that is actually related to student understanding and thinking. And I think one of the most important volumes that has emerged in this entire 20-year plus period is the volume by Bob Mislevy on sociocultural foundations of educational measurement, in which he brings together a sociocultural perspective and a measurement perspective, all in the context of evidence-centered reasoning. So my argument is we have made a lot of progress in all three areas, building upon ideas from how people know. I'm sorry. Yes, how people learn and knowing what students know. And we have filled out a great deal of knowledge about cognition, about how to engage in the design of the observations connected to that knowledge base, and then how to make maximum use of interpreting the kinds of evidence, all of which can reflect back to the kinds of assessments we design and use. But I want to go back to the vision. Are we there yet? And the answer is no. And I'll indicate why in terms of three important challenges that we need to embrace. The first challenge is putting knowledge and innovations into practice. And what do I mean by this? Despite the considerable progress we've made over the last 20 plus years, a lot of work remains to be done to effectively integrate many of the developments into assessment use cases that range from the classroom to the district and the state levels. And basically, our efforts and advances, as wonderful as they are, including all of the examples and reports that I talked about, are fragmented. They often fail to connect with each other, especially across disciplinary boundaries. We have work on cognition and student learning in the various disciplines, but it tends to be siloed. We have work on assessment design for classroom or large-scale applications. It, too, tends to be siloed, especially relative to the cognition and student learning piece. We have work on technology for the design, delivery, data capture, and data analysis. Well, some of that makes connections, but a lot of it doesn't. We have work on measurement and interpretation, and we also have a lot of work on teacher knowledge and practice and assessment literacy. So the knowledge base has grown exponentially, but it is siloed, largely siloed. It is not connected to each other. And in essence, what we have are very important research and development-based projects, but we have little to show at scale. And it's the at scale is where we need to get to. So what's it going to take? Well, I'm going to use the metaphor of it takes a village, and I'll return to it shortly on what I mean by that. But the point is that we can't keep this work siloed. Okay? We need to scale it up, and the only way to do that is to have these communities working together, and some of the things that we need to support that effort. So that's the first challenge. We have yet to really have an impact, whether it's at the classroom level or the large-scale assessment level, in terms of everything that we have learned and all the capabilities we have right now. What's the second challenge? The second challenge is broadening the scope of what we can and should assess. And what do I mean by that? Well, there have been two important trends that have characterized discourse about what we want students to know and be able to do to function well in the 21st century. One of those conversations was about deeper learning. Concerns that the knowledge that students have gained in school is knowledge that does not transfer. We want knowledge that transfers, and we want knowledge that is deeper with respect to disciplinary principles that in fact undergird that transfer process. We also have a discourse about so-called 21st century skills, competencies that, quote, transcend disciplines, things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, collaboration. There's any number of lists of this. You can find them nationally, internationally, et cetera. And these ideas and their implications for teaching, learning, and assessment have been discussed and debated in multiple volumes. We can go back to the Education for Life and Work volume, Developing Transferable Knowledge and Skills in the 21st Century, where we talked about this in terms of what does deeper learning mean relative to contemporary standards and theories of learning. What are these so-called 21st century skills, and how can we think about them relative to the knowledge base? There have been volumes like the Deeper Learning volume edited by Jim Valanka and with numerous contributions. Most recently, OECD issued a report last year on innovating assessments to measure and support complex skills, particularly these so-called 21st century skills, but not just limited to that. And just last week, the Educational Testing Service issued a report called Charting the Future of Assessments, which very much focused on the so-called 21st century skills issues in terms of issues of assessment and their implications for citizens and the workforce. Some representative categories of these 21st century competencies are shown here. There's obviously ones in the cognitive domain, but there's ones in the interpersonal domain, as well as the intrapersonal domain, the metacognitive, and some people include areas like civics and citizenship, as well as digital literacy and media literacy. Now, I'm not saying each of these has the same value, but there are a variety of taxonomies and typologies out there about these so-called 21st century competencies. One of the things that I most appreciate about this report that was issued last year by OECD, Innovating Assessments to Measure and Support Complex Skills, was its attempt to recognize and attack the problem. Basically, the report indicates, first of all, that we need to better define these complex competencies for purposes of assessment. There are differing perspectives on what they mean and what would be the evidence. But it is clear that the competencies we're talking about will inevitably be associated with complex forms of evidence. And assessing these complex constructs will demand innovation in the ways in which we design assessments to be able to capture that evidence. And doing that requires capitalizing on the affordances of technology. In fact, technology becomes central in an evidence-centered design and inference process, as well as the challenges this poses for measurement models and typical measurement procedures. Now, when you move into this space, it becomes very challenging on a number of other dimensions because it raises issues of comparability, fairness, opportunity to learn, equity, and social justice. So as we think about developing innovative assessments that are using technology, we have to now think about what is the background of students and individuals who are going to interact with these assessments in terms of their capacity to even understand what we're asking them to do in perhaps these complex reasoning tasks. So as we open up a space of possibilities of assessing these 21st century competencies and providing evidence of them, we have to think really hard about whether that evidence is going to be valid and for whom, and the kinds of the inferences we want to make. So for the results of these assessments to be useful to different stakeholders, they have to be valid. They have to assess those competencies they purport to measure and not others, and that's going to be a challenge with respect to validation. We also have to think about how we're going to report the forms of evidence generated by innovative assessments, and it has to be done in a way that accurately reflects the complexity of the constructs assessed and the intended interpretive uses. I think that what we've learned, oftentimes the desire to do this is reflected in international assessment programs. But one of the difficulties and challenges with international assessment programs is the lack of comparability in terms of the meaning of the results across countries and individuals, given their respective opportunities to learn. On the other hand, we shouldn't shy away from these challenges because, in fact, we are going to need to be able to measure these competencies and these skills, because this is what the workforce employers are saying. These are the skills that we want in our citizens, in addition to whatever disciplinary knowledge and deeper learning that comes from what happens in the education context. Again, I'm going to argue it takes a village, and I'll come back to this just in a moment. What's the third challenge? The third challenge is actually one that goes back to knowing what students know. It is designing and implementing balanced assessment systems. In knowing what students know, we argued that assessments at all levels, from the classroom to the state, will work together in a system that is comprehensive, coherent, and continuous. In such a system, assessments would provide a variety of evidence to support educational decision-making, and assessment at all levels would be linked back to the same underlying model of student learning and would provide indications of student growth over time. That was the vision we had for balanced assessments. Well, let's talk about reality. Balanced assessment are educational assessment's mythical creature, okay? We have been searching for them in the wild like we search for the unicorn, and yet we have not found one. And one question is, well, could they ever exist? Well, I think we need to ask, why can't we seem to find one, and what got in the way? I think many of you know the answer to part of this, but I'll give you my story. Timing is everything. Knowing What Students Know came out in 2001. What else came out in 2001? Oh, a little thing that George Bush dreamed up called No Child Left Behind. Okay? So what has happened since that legislation is what we have implemented, and it's become very pernicious in terms of the educational assessment climate. We put in place policies of test-based accountability for schools and teachers. And so what happened was we jacked up the amount of standardized testing that was going on. Every kid, every year, in ELA and mathematics, and then we tacked on science 3 times over the course of in elementary, middle school, and high school. And on top of that, we placed accountability, first schools, and then for a little while we had teacher accountability. And those same policies and those same testing regimens exist right now. ESSA just simply did change some things, but it did not change fundamentally the issue of testing in the schools. And what did that do? There was an explosion of commercial interim assessments and positioning them as critical components of balanced systems. So the imbalance that we created was associated with privileging state-level and then district-level assessments, generally at the expense of support for the development of ambitious classroom learning and assessment environments and associated teacher professional learning. We did everything from a policy perspective that could destroy the vision that was in Knowing What Students Know for balanced assessment systems. We made assessment outside the classroom all the focus of energy, and then essentially we made that the target, and it drove what was happening in the school. Any of us who works in schools knows what happens in the spring when the tests are coming up and how instruction starts to get oriented to preparing for the large-scale test. Another thing contributing to this is, in general, a lack of knowledge of human learning and its implication for assessment design and interpretation. Well, so I mentioned before that just this last week, last Wednesday, the National Academy of Education issued a report called Reimagining Balanced Assessment Systems. And the question is, well, can we get it right now? So we need to understand what the goal of this volume is, and it's to provide guidance to state and local education agencies as well as schools and teachers regarding how to foster and maintain a culture of productive assessment use to improve ambitious and equitable teaching and learning at the classroom level, to design policy, professional learning, and other local systems necessary to implement balanced assessment systems, and implement a system to use the data to continually improve the assessment system in student learning, and then implement processes to use aggregate data to continually improve the assessment system itself to better serve all students, especially those most disenfranchised. The volume has 9 chapters, and the goal is to paint a coherent picture of the elements that would contribute to achieving a balanced assessment system that supports equitable, ambitious teaching and learning. And the focus of this is at the classroom. What can we do in the world of assessment, regardless of the level at which it's operating, to focus on that it supports ambitious teaching and learning at the classroom? So there's some framing in history. There are chapters that talk about what do we now know about human learning and development and its implications for assessment. What do we know about ambitious teaching that includes classroom assessment practices? And what do we know about professional learning for assessment literacy at the classroom level? We also are not ignoring the fact that classroom teachers exist in classrooms, they exist in schools, which exist in context of districts and states. So there's 2 chapters that discuss what is the role of the district and what is the proper role of the state in supporting the design and implementation of balanced assessment systems. And we're not naive about the organizational complexities or the policy issues, and there's 2 chapters that focus on that. So I'm here to advertise the volume because I think it has some very important messages with respect to embarking on a path to essentially reimagining and implementing balanced assessment systems. There's some basic assumptions here, fundamental assumptions. One is that all assessments essentially must be relevant and sustainable for all racial, linguistic, and culturally groups. That when the assessment is integrated with curriculum instruction, it can and should happen at the nexus of learning and serve as assessment of, for, and as learning. And it should be a tool to improve teaching and foster student learning. The other important point is to remember that no assessment results can be interpreted without thinking about context. That is, thinking about issues of opportunity to learn. You can't make sense of the results of an assessment if you don't know what the conditions were or the surrounding opportunity to learn for the students. And I think one of the messages we tried to send is that this requires designers and developers of assessments at all levels to address this fundamental question. To what extent does the use of this assessment support or hinder equitable and ambitious teaching and learning? That's a question, a fundamental question that has to be asked, whether you're designing for the classroom or designing for district level assessment or for the state assessment. We offered an updated definition of balanced assessment. I won't read it to you, but except for the first part. Balanced assessment systems and practices are intentionally designed to provide feedback to students and information for teachers to support ambitious and equitable instructional and learning activities. Question is, can we make it happen? Is this just yet another, mythical creature that we're trying to create and we will never be able to find it in the wild? Now, we have to recognize it won't be easy or quick. But one of the things I would argue is 20 years later, we have the wisdom of hindsight as well as the conceptual knowledge and the design tools to make progress, to make significant progress. But it would be naive to say it's going to be easy. It's not, okay? We all know about the political context that we're in. But our question is, do we have the will and do we have the resources? So let me sort of close this with trying to address the question of what will it take to make progress in meeting the challenges and attaining the vision. Now, I've posed 3 challenges. Let me just reiterate that. One challenge is integrating knowledge and capabilities from multiple disciplines and scaling up validated solutions. We have things that we can put in play, but can we essentially scale them up? Another challenge is developing and implementing assessments of complex 21st century competencies. And the third is designing and implementing balanced assessment systems. My argument is we need 3 types of capital. It's not just about money, although money helps. We need intellectual capital, we need fiscal capital, and we need political capital. Intellectual capital. If there's anything we've learned as those of us who try to bring together knowledge from cognition, learning, assessment, measurement, is that next generation assessment development, validation, and implementation is inherently a multidisciplinary enterprise. It needs different communities of experts to work together collaboratively. It does take a village. There is no project that I have heard here or that's been reported here that has actually made some significant progress in developing assessments that are aligned with current learning theory and instructional frameworks that hasn't brought together people from multiple disciplines. And by this I mean disciplinary learning experts, learning scientists, assessment design experts, curriculum and instructional design experts, measurement experts, data scientists, interface designers, and administrators, teachers, and students. It is very difficult to make progress if we don't get these communities talking together and working together. And every successful project that I know of has semblances of bringing all of these folks together. Fiscal capital. Developing and validating technology-enabled and cognitively challenging assessment tasks and environments is a time-consuming and costly activity. Such new instruments require considerable R&D work carried out by, as I said, interdisciplinary experts regarding content, task design, implementation, data analysis, scoring, reporting, and validation. There's no question that you just can't say to a teacher, "Oh, go write me some items." All right? I think they will write you items, but they're not going to be essentially. They're going to be replicating the past. So sustained and increased funding for the type of research and development needed is really a key element in advancing next generation science. If not, it will be impossible to generate the solutions required for valid and useful assessment of challenging constructs. And investment is also needed in bringing existing innovative assessments to full maturity by scaling their implementation when they show promising evidence. Think about all the money that is spent on educational assessment and where it is spent and how it is spent. And if we were to redirect parts of that to addressing these challenges, we would be able to make far more progress. Right now, the effort is fragmented in part because the innovative work is being funded by the Institute for Education Sciences, the NSF, and we know that that is, it's good for 3-4 years on a project, and then you're on to something else. Okay? And unfortunately, those agencies aren't responsible for worrying about scaling. I wish they were at times, but somebody has to essentially provide the resources to back up this kind of work, because it's not going to be immediately pay off in terms of saleable products. And in most of the environment we have right now, where the money goes is to what products sell. large-scale tests, interim assessments. And what's the last one? Political capital. We're talking about change, which is enormous. The change of the type that's needed requires really strong political will and vision to encourage people to think beyond what's possible now. It is very hard to think beyond right now in terms of what next generation assessment should look like. Now, without political will, it will be impossible to generate sufficient fiscal capital to assemble the intellectual capital required to pursue next-generation assessment development and implementation, and to achieve meaningful change in educational assessment. You need all three things together. And when I say political capital, I'm not just talking about policymakers. I'm not talking about the feds in Washington, okay? It encompasses multiple assessments, multiple segments of the educational assessment community. And that includes the measurement and psychometric community, the educational practice community, and others, because we all have, each of these communities has entrenched assumptions and practices when it comes to assessment. This is the way we do things. This is the kind of assessments we need to have, okay? And so, political capital means that all of these essential stakeholders have to have the will to participate in what is a massive redirection of effort in terms of the kinds of assessments we need. So just a couple of final reflections, and I think I'm within my time. I want to talk about the wisdom of hindsight. I think that's what this whole lecture today is about, is the wisdom of hindsight and then trying to actually have some foresight. Well, one question is whether Lindquist, Glazers, and other pioneers were wrong about what they envisioned for educational assessment regarding its educational and societal benefits. They were fundamentally correct, but contextually naive. They lived in a time which is very different from the time we are living in. A lot has changed. Multiple dimensions of knowledge, practice, societal expectations, policy, and politics are all part of the current context. Educational assessment has grown into a very big business with multiple use cases and contexts of deployment. There's a lot at stake here and for multiple stakeholders. And I think perhaps most important is that educational assessment is no longer just about what we want students to know and be able to do, but it has become entangled with issues of educational policy and larger socio-political arguments about diversity and equity. And those are important arguments. We need to attend to them, but we need to understand that that is the context in which any perspective on educational assessment operates. So I would say our job, and for those of you who are younger than me, your job is to move things forward as best you can. And one of the things that hindsight provides us at this point is we can recognize the errors and pitfalls of the past while embracing the complexities that are associated with our current situation, while pursuing, I think we continue to pursue a fundamental tenet that educational assessment can substantially contribute to educational and societal good. The vision of people like Lindquist and Glazer, I think, was on the mark. It is our job to figure out how to make that work, given everything we've learned and everything we still need to do to make that vision a reality in our current world. Now, that's a long list of names up there. Many of you will find your names up there. I could not be standing here. I could not have contributed to all the different things that I've worked on without a bunch of collaborators, colleagues, and individuals from whom I have learned tremendously. If your name isn't up there, I ran out of space. The font, I can only make the font so small. But I want to express, the way I think about things is the function of of my interacting with many people, going back to Bob Glazer and everybody I've interacted with since then. And I deeply thank them, because whatever I think about assessment, and even though we may disagree violently about some parts of it, I have learned from everybody I have interacted with, collaborated with, my students, my postdocs, and so I treasure those interactions, and your name is up there somewhere. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. So we have some time for questions. This session is being recorded, so we do ask that you come to the microphone, and we'll take your questions.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for your lifetime work. The report on 21st century skills, which was immensely useful as an integrative piece on which are the skills that matter, is also a complex report. It takes a while to read it. It's great for academics. But in a world where we are trained, academics, when we want to communicate to the public, to write at a fourth grade reading level, I suspect that one of the reasons the report has not had the traction that it deserves with communities of legislators and with the people who are in charge of the large assessments is because of the complexity. It's difficult. So what are your thoughts on whether we can simplify these messages so that they stick?
Well, I think, your point is well taken in general. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about how people learn, knowing what students know, 21st century skills, you name it. They are all academic reports from national academies, and so they meet certain stringent requirements. But there are examples of essentially taking those reports and then writing briefs from them that are directed to different audiences. I think the biggest challenge is the audience of policymakers, because one of the euphemisms is in that a policymaker is not going to read anything that's more than one page. So it does speak to the fact that as a community, we have to learn how to distill our ideas into information that can be useful to policymakers to convince them about the relevance or importance of something. And academics tend to want to hedge all the time. For example, the report we just issued from the National Academy on Reimagining Balanced Assessment Systems. That's a 300-page report. No policymaker is they might use it as a doorstop, but that's about all. But we intend to produce briefs for different practice communities. And that requires that we hire individuals who know how to do that communication. Me in particular, I'm not particularly good at doing that kind of writing. But there are individuals, and we're actually working with some to try to communicate these things. The OECD report that came out last year on measuring complex constructs, I think within the OECD community, it's actually having some traction because you have translators like Andreas, who is an excellent communicator and who is very influential. But I think the point is that we have to find ways to get the messages across in ways that appeal to a vision of that policymakers can buy into. And one of the things I think they can buy into is the fact that we need to have ways to better educate our students in the ways in which assessment can be a valuable contribution to that. Right now, when most discussions are about assessment, people immediately think of a test. So if there's, it's kind of like, well, assessment, test, measurement is like they are the same thing, and we know they're not. So part of it is also learning how to communicate effectively so that we don't set off all the alarms immediately. But if you've got some magic way to do that, it is true. We just, I would have to say, though, if you look at a report like How People Learn, even though it was, quote, an academic report, and it had tremendous impact on educators. It was not a report that largely was read by academics. It was read in the education community and had, I think, very profound impact there. But part of it was because there was some translation that was being done, including what we tried to do in some of the things in the shorter report, bridging research and practice.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for your reading and thoughts and speaking on this topic. I really appreciate it. So first, maybe I'll give away, I represent an assessment vendor. So I'm coming at this, I come at this and I think about it, and the assessment practices and products are quite well entrenched in schools, in districts. So I see these as massive shifts that you're talking about towards ambitious and equitable assessments and outcomes. And of course, to be able to support teaching and deeper learning. These are massive shifts. And so what I'm wondering is what ideas you and others might have is that how do assessment vendors and developers move in these incremental ways towards what you're talking about to pursue assessment for social good? Because, you talk about legislators and practitioners. Well, actually, in my experience, a lot of times the legislators and practitioners are guided by the companies and developers, and we want to be conscientious about that. So where do we start?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you're right on with respect to there's deep entrenchments of practices that exists in states, districts, and schools, and because part of it is that with No Child Left Behind, we really accelerated the use of standardized tests and then everything aligned to that, associated with that. So vendors are in a bit of a challenging position. They need to have products that can meet the requirements that the feds set out, as well as essentially that can work and be economical. The problem is that you're also, in many cases, the vendors are working on some innovative assessment practices as well, but the problem is it's a risk to try to scale them, to try to put them in. And I think a good example of the risk that's involved is with some of the state enhanced assessment grants, where states have tried to do some innovative things with respect to assessment, and in some cases they've actually abandoned it because the federal requirement was, while you're doing this, you have to continue to do this, which is the standardized assessment practices, and you have to show that they in some ways relate to each other. It reminds me of the old days when if you had a new aptitude or intelligence test and you wanted to put it into the marketplace, you had to show that it correlated with the Stanford Binet, but not so high that it was exactly the same as the Stanford Binet. But what happens is that becomes the criterion. So I think the challenge, I think there's two things that have to happen. One is we have to somewhat give policymakers a vision and help them understand how some of the constraints that they put on things is not leading to productive assessment. I think the other part of it is, and I don't blame the testing companies for this, I think that the education community, the consumers, have to essentially demand a different kind of assessment and a different kind of quality. Okay, so things are not going to change if the very consumer or user of the assessment doesn't see the vision of what kind of assessments we need. If we don't have a desire for quality, we're not going to get quality. We're going to get what is standard operating practice. But it's a risk because I also know that the economics of large-scale standardized testing, while you make money, you don't have big margins either. In fact, many companies have been driven out of that arena because they can't make money in that arena. So, yeah, this is, I don't know where where the financial capital is going to come from if it's all being driven by, okay, we have this business and that's where the income comes from. But I think it's going to have to come from foundations and others. Because I think there's a lot of talent in the assessment world, but it's not being it's not being channeled into things that are different than what we're doing right now. But I don't have a magic solution to that. No silver bullet. This is a massive change process. So we have to think about it over time. It's not going to instantly happen, but we also need to scale up. I mean, there's very good things that are out there right now, but they're small scale, and investment is needed in trying them out. Because if we don't try them out at some reasonable scale and show what they can do, we'll never be able to replace what we have. So it's kind of like, we have to fly the plane we're flying, but we have to also be developing the prototype or the new one and figure out how to get it to fly and then show how it's much better than the one we've got. But that's a risk and an investment.
Congratulations, Bill. My name is Steve McGee, Morning Partnership.
As you were talking about the idea of it takes a village, one of the things that popped in my head was schools for thought, which predates the how people learn,
Yeah.
where some of the pillars of learning sciences kind of got together. Ann Brown, John Bransford, Marlene Scardomelli, and Carl Breiter. So let's take what we know, come together with a small set of schools. And a great volume that sort of talks about the complexity at the social level of actually bringing these ideas together. So I think it's just to think about that idea of integration that you brought up. One is at the level of integration of writing reports and bringing these ideas together. But I think we need to think about integration of specific geographic contexts where we come together to make it work in a specific setting.
I don't disagree with that. I also remember fondly Schools for Thought because it involved those of us at Vanderbilt and Ann and Joe and Marlene and Carl and a bunch of other folks. And it's a very interesting historical case because what we brought together was anchored instruction, fostering communities of learners, and computer-supported collaborative learning. And we, first of all, there's a little insight here. We thought we were all on the same page. We had to learn to talk to each other, okay, and learn how to integrate these things. We did. With the support of the James S. McDonald Foundation and John Brewer, actually implement a set of practices in professional learning in the St. Louis schools, but also in the Nashville public schools. And things were actually going very well. Guess what happened? Administrations changed. Even with evidence in the Nashville public schools about the significant impact of the Schools for Thought, curriculum and instructional effort and on student achievement, a new superintendent came in and said, we're not doing that anymore. So this is, again, the context can defeat this. But I do think, I think we have to think about what we're trying to do, not at this, we tend to think, oh, the United States, okay? Well, the United States is 50 different countries, okay? As we now know, in terms of, it's not just red and blue, okay? And so each state, in some respects, is its own system. And then within those states, you have districts, large and small, et cetera. So I think what we have to think about is where are there opportunities for productive change? because there are lots of them out there in different school districts in certain states. I think even about the effort that's going on in Chicago Public Schools right now with essentially the Skyline curriculum and assessment work. I mean, that's a bold experiment in a district that is bigger than the size of many states. So I believe that, we can make progress, but not if we're going to think about this as we're going to change the entire United States. I think that the progress has to be localized. And in fact, Schools for Thought was an interesting collaborative because then it did involve collaborations between researchers and teachers and administrators. And it had a base. It just couldn't sustain because what happened was the intervention of administrators who basically shut things down. But let me add one caveat to that. The residue of Schools for Thought remained in terms of teachers and their practice. Even though there was no formal Schools for Thought, it did have an impact on how teachers thought about their kids, how thought about instruction. So we have to think about essentially what's our strategy for change. It's not just all up here. Some of it has to be down at the base level, and sometimes word spreads. I think one of the things that's been most troubling about what we've seen with respect to assessment is the proliferation of, you have to have this piece of software or you have to do this interim assessment. And how does that spread? Because superintendents talk to other superintendents and say, what are you doing? And that's how, oftentimes these things spread, oftentimes to the detriment of making, intelligent choices in districts. I know we've been dealing with that in Illinois. In terms of what's happened with assessment in Illinois in districts. So there's no magic bullet here. But I do think we have to think locally as well as more nationally. But the national issues are issues about federal assessment policy. And it turns out that while there are a number of limitations there are degrees of freedom that people have yet to explore. So I think you've got to work multiple levels in this system. But it isn't, nobody's saying it's going to be easy. But what made Schools for Thought work was because there were examples from each of the different programs, our anchored instruction work, the fostering communities of learners, and the Cecil work, of what it could do for students and teachers. And that can be very convincing when you want to get individuals at another level to sort of support an innovation.
Another question? Right.
Hello, this is Namsu Shin. I'm a Michigan State University, and then I'm really enjoyed actually your lecture, and then I'm quite appreciated your valuable, your inspiration for us. And my question is, actually, I'm interested in the learning for assessment for learning. Mm-hmm. So now, as you know, that is artificial intelligence right now. We have new era, and so now it's the kind of one assessment. For example, we can create a general assessment for everyone, but individual teacher can modify their assessment based on their student contact background, student background. Mm-hmm. So in that case, there's always I'm thinking about is what is the validity? How we can make whether my this kind of individualized, personalized assessment by teacher level, and then right now is the measurement model is all of unified, and we have to meet that kind of qualification. For example, we have to publish in journal. Mm-hmm. So do you have any suggestion? Now is the kind of we are going to have a new era, and you pave us here, and you say that we are going to run 2 miles. So what is your suggestion? Suggestion to be the kind of, now is the kind of more complex, the assessment itself, not one unified one. So what is your suggestion for literary issue?
Well, it's more than a mile. It's a lot of miles, but I think you're raising a really interesting point. We have capabilities now, particularly where we can do things with teachers and close to instruction, where there's adaptations that can be made, and I think at that level we have to invoke different criteria for what constitutes a validity argument, okay? Because much of when we talk about validity, it's couched in terms that have to do with a lot of large-scale assessment. But we can construct a validity argument for instructionally supportive assessment in terms of its cognitive validity. That is, it's actually getting at important knowledge and skills, that it has instructional utility, it's aligned with what we want to teach and then helps teachers figure out progress. And even I would call inferential validity, because we can demonstrate that essentially the performance, the evidence that we're getting is consistent with a particular model. It doesn't mean we have to fit an IRT model to it or engage in certain kinds of measurement approaches. Because, again, we have to think about the validity of an assessment is with respect to its intended interpretive use. Okay, and when we're operating at the classroom level or in terms of formative assessment, 2 things are true. One is any one assessment or any evidence we acquire is you can think about it as it's updating your information and your priors in a kind of Bayesian conception. But you always have the opportunity to add information, add knowledge, because you are in a changing instructional environment. So let's say we make a wrong interpretation from student performance. If it's a teacher who knows the student and has the opportunity to interact with the student, they can collect additional evidence that's going to change that Bayesian model. So the difference is, in a large-scale testing context, we have one shot. And so we maximize the reliability, and that's what we're concerned about, because we don't have another shot, okay? And how do we do that? By having lots of tasks. This is a sort of lots of tasks that individually don't have much reliability, but collectively, it's the old Spearman, and that's the, I sometimes tell students, that's the dirty little secret of large-scale assessment. You can generate a large number of items, and essentially none of which is terribly reliable on its own. But if you have enough of them, and you use Spearman's prophecy formula and do other things, you can produce a reliable score. Okay. Now, is it valid? Is it useful? Maybe. Okay. Depends on what you want to do with it. But I think about this as, again, if we go back to assessment as a process of reasoning from evidence, okay, what are we trying to reason about? What are we doing with respect to the observation and then the interpretation? What's important is AI can assist in that interpretation, but I would never want to sort of say, okay, that we're going to use AI to tell a teacher, without any caveats, this is exactly true. It is really almost like what AI can do to support teachers in doing what is actually the hardest part of implementing a formative assessment process. Because right now, when we tell teachers you need to do formative assessment, they have to first of all find the materials, they have to administer them, they have to score them, and then they have to make sense of them. Okay? And then figure out, once you've got that, what am I going to do next? So there's lots of tools, and you know this in terms of automated scoring, AI, and other things, where we can build more diagnostic item sets and do the interpretation on the fly if we validated this, and then give teachers more useful instructional information to act upon. Even allowing for variation in terms of having teachers adapt the assessments. But of course, teachers need to know, well, within what limits can I adapt this assessment? Okay. Am I changing the scenario so the kid understands the situation better, or am I doing something fundamentally in terms of changing what the knowledge and skills are? But I do want to caution that we have to, as we think about inventing these tools and things to support classroom practice, we have to work with teachers to figure out, how does this get integrated into their practice? Okay? We can't just say, oh, we've got a solution for you. Here, use this. Okay? I think we have to collaborate with the end users so that what we build with the tools we have, including AI, is actually something that they can use, and they help us shape the way in which it gets used. It makes me think about, all of us have interacted with complex systems, whether it's for accounting or for HR or whatever. Some computer science people go off and build a system, and then they put it in place, and they never talk to the end user. Okay, so what happens? You have to build a user interface on the system because they never actually thought about the true end user of this system. So I think the true end user of a lot of what we want is the teacher and the student.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you all for being here. We have time for one short question if anyone has one. And if not, I want to thank you very much for your presentation and for all of your contributions over your career and the work that have inspired all of us to continue on this path, this long and winding road, this many miles to go. I also am in large-scale testing, and I often will say my whole career is based on No Child Left Behind, and I am hoping we can get back to something that really is meaningfully changing and bringing that village together, because it is getting those financial dollars with the political will in the places where we can do something innovative that moves the needle forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all.